And good morning, everybody, as we bring you now this next half hour, give or take, some minutes with McCoy Hiestand's attorneys at law. And hit the right button here, and we'll welcome in Sheila Hiestand from McCoy Hiestand Attorneys at Law. And Chad is a little bit delayed today, so we'll...
He's actually in court, so...
He's working.
Yes,
No,
exactly.
I don't know whether he made it up over the weekend for the huge robotics competition that took place in Louisville. I was telling him about it last week, and then I failed to send him any information, but I know that his two children, two boys, were involved in robotics.
Yeah, and he's actually, I believe, the parental leader of the team, so...
And they had like I don't know if it was the world or the U.S., because we actually flew on an airplane back into Louisville earlier in the week with some of the young boys and girls, young men and women, coming in, and then they were unloading their boxes, which were their robots.
Yes, it's fascinating.
It is indeed. Well, Sheila, we're going to talk about a variety of things today involving the law. Speaking of involving, here he comes. We'll involve Chad when he gets in the building with us here. But
my mad partner running into the studio.
I made it.
You may make sure we got all of our mics up and active here. So, welcome in, Chad.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Double check our audio. As we were saying, coming on the air here, we're going to take a look at some topics. One of them is municipalities. We live in one. And I guess if you don't live in an incorporated city, the municipality or the whatever the governing unit would be, your county, I guess, would be if you had an issue. But let's just say, for the sake of being able for me to understand it, we're talking about living in a community that is a legally created,
incorporated sort of city.
And it has to be a city. The laws we're going to talk about relate to cities.
Cities, okay.
Municipalities,
Right.
yes.
Okay.
Because counties have some benefits of sovereign immunity under the state, being a part of the state, that the cities don't. So there are different rules for cities than there are for counties.
I'll ask this question. Are there different rules from state to state?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
So we're just going to talk about Kentucky.
Kentucky municipalities, all right.
And specifically slip and falls. If you're walking down the street and you slip on an uneven sidewalk that has been there a long time and hasn't been marked or fixed, or there's a hole in the sidewalk, or I used to represent the cities. This is years and years ago, 15 years ago I did this kind of work. And those water meter covers that you think are safe and sound, they're often unlocked and flip through all the time. And what happens is people step through and they end up with a mid-leg fracture or an ankle fracture or even a hip fracture if the leg goes all the way down. Really nasty injuries. And you think, okay, under Kentucky statute of limitations, I would think I'd have a year to do something about it, but that's not true. If you're on a walkway or a roadway that's owned and managed by the city, you only have 90 days to give written, from the date of the incident, to give very specific written notice to the mayor, and if it's a city council, whomever, and you have to do it by certified mail, return receipt requested. You have to give specific notice under KRS 411-180, I believe it is. Don't quote me on that. But it has to say where it happened, exactly where it happened, exactly what the defect was, exactly what your injuries were, what time of day it was. The statute's very clear, and if you don't follow all those rules, and you're not extremely specific in following those rules, and you don't get it served on them within the 90 days, you are forever barred from bringing a suit for whatever catastrophic injuries you may suffer as against the city.
And courts have determined it, Ralph, to be jurisdictional in that even though the mayor may know, we had a case a few years ago where the mayor came out and helped the person who had fallen, called the ambulance, clearly, in fact, the lady ended up being related to city council members, and, I won't say what city it was not here in Bardstown, but even though everybody was there, knew, had been to the hospital, non-compliance with that notice provision in the specific way bars that claim.
So make sure that, because we've talked, you guys certainly know much more about that than I do, but some injuries don't necessarily take on their worst
Right.
until 6 months later. If it's something that's injured a back, it's the next little twist, which may be 6 months later that.
Well, and like on a back, for example, the normal course of treatment is let's get you into physical therapy for 6 weeks and
Right.
see how it does. Then let's try cortisone injections. All right, now we're going to go do the MRI because they don't want to spend the money, and that's when you find out, wait a minute, we've got a major problem here.
And let me tell you, the first big snowstorm we had was back mid-January or end of January. So we're almost 90 days away from that now. That seems like yesterday,
Yeah.
right? So 90 days is nothing. By the time let's say you've broken something, you go to the hospital, you sit in the ER, they send you a week later to an orthopedist who then puts you in a cast for 6 weeks, and then you have to do PT. Well, by the time you're done with PT, your 90 days is long since over. Time just flies like that. So that's really why we wanted to bring this up today, that if you get hurt on a sidewalk, on a walkway that is owned by the city, or you think may be owned by the city, you need to get in touch with an attorney right away.
We always talk about, and there's mine, our phones now have good cameras on them. Probably another thing is take a picture of exactly where it happened.
That's right. That's right. Take pictures of everything. I will tell you, I was out training, this was a couple years ago, and there was one of those situations where an oak tree had pulled up a slab of concrete on a sidewalk, and it caused an uneven mark, and it actually made me fall over and knocked me out. And I sent my proper letter to the city, and their defense was, well, this is the first we've heard of it.
Right.
And I was like, well, I find that hard to believe, but even with an open records request, they wouldn't give me the information. Luckily, it knocked me out, but I was fine. Well, I don't know if Chad would agree with that. But
Explains all kinds of things now.
But if I would have had to file a formal suit to get that information. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The knowing what the other side knows is that called discovery? You guys.
You're dead on.
Okay.
Right.
You've learned well.
And that's something that the
How do I?
layperson is not going to get, not going to know what to ask. They may or may not know what the word and terminology is.
Right.
Right.
And unfortunately, for a lot of that, we can't even get discovery until we file suit.
That's right.
Yeah.
Unless we have subpoena power, we're kind of at a loss. They're under no obligation to tell us what their insurance limits are, to give us information. Without the power of discovery and the power of subpoenas, which only comes into play once the lawsuit's filed, we're pretty much in the dark. One thing you mentioned, lay people, came up to me on my way over here. My son was taken by ambulance from the football field last summer for dehydration, and taken by rural Metro, and they sent us a bill this month for $2,400 and said pay it now. Well, I'm looking at the bill, and they bill us incorrectly. I mean, it's itemized. They bill us incorrectly for the first amount, and they write that off. Then they bill us for the correct amount, and they submit to the insurance company, and it says insurance pays this amount, agreed upon reduction this amount due is zero, and they say you owe us $2,500, $2,493 or something like that, which is clearly wrong. So I want people to be aware when you get a medical bill, look at it very closely. Chad and I are used to looking at medical bills. So if you're injured, not just by slip and falls, but in any fashion, and you get a medical bill and you had health insurance or you had Medicaid, you had any kind of insurance coverage, take a look at that. Don't just automatically call them up and pay them or get into a payment plan.
Right.
Look at it very, very closely, because what this particular group has done, I consider it harassment and fraud, but that's because I'm angry. I may soften, I may not. But I just want people to know that just because you get a bill from a provider does not mean that that bill is accurate, and does not mean that you owe that amount. You need to look at it carefully. You may definitely owe that amount, but make sure you look at it very, very carefully.
When we're talking about municipalities, and Chad, you and I have talked, and Sheila, I'm sure we've talked about it too. We talk about the sidewalk. Who owns that sidewalk? I think I know who owns the street. Whose
Right.
responsibilities are those two pieces of turf? Well, in this case, concrete and asphalt.
It differs from county to county and city to city. Cities are typically responsible for the maintenance of the walkways, the curbs, the roadways. Now, in a place like Louisville, that's a metro government where the city and the county have merged, they may have placed it in the hands of a group that is deemed to be part of the county, you still have to give the city notice, but you may be limited on your legal responsibilities. However, now when we're talking about snow clearing, whose responsibility it is to clear the snow, that's different. And the laws have changed. It used to be when you had a sidewalk out in front of your house, it was your obligation to make sure that it was clear of debris. But if you undertook that obligation and you did so poorly, you could be held liable. And if you didn't, and someone slipped and fell, well then they were responsible for knowing it was snowy and what have you. The laws are in a state of flux right now. But when it comes down to snow and ice removal, that is the homeowner's responsibility, not the city's. Not so on the roadway. The roadway, it comes down to the city, and they get to choose. That's a discretionary function as to what roads are to be cleared. They get to establish what are primary roadways, secondary roadways, tertiary roadways. So.
And Roth, you may remember, I think it was last summer, they came through on our sidewalks, right, and they leveled off. They had a team come out and they were measuring the crack differentials and then grinding them smooth. Yeah. So the city has that obligation here.
I'm glad to hear that they're taking responsibility for it.
Maybe they did a good job.
Had I been here, maybe I wouldn't have fallen.
Right.
You'd just enjoyed the rise or fall. Whatever. Before we go any further, we kind of jumped into this. Let's do a little bit of a disclaimer from Chad McCoy first.
Happy to talk to you about anything and everything, but we can't give legal advice over the radio. So if you do have a question, please feel free to give us a call at 348-2222. Be glad to talk to you. If it is something confidential in nature, though, give us a call at the office at 233-8385, and we can talk about it there.
Okay. We are with Chad McCoy and Sheila Hiestand from McCoy Hiestand, attorneys at law on South 3rd Street here in Bardstown. Municipalities, we've talked about the fact that wherever the city limits ends today here in Bardstown, those laws differ from what's on I guess you would sometimes find even on the other side of the street.
That's right.
So keep that in mind, and it's easier to have somebody like you guys.
And the important lesson is just get to a lawyer quick.
Yeah.
You know, that's what needs to happen.
Yeah. We talked about suing or considering the legal options about a municipality, and then we talked about government being at certain levels, city, county, state, and federal government. The U.S. government is a big animal, and they're not immune from litigation.
They're not. They have big immunities, but they have created what's called the Federal Torts Claims Act, and what that does is it is written to say that anywhere that an individual could be held liable, the U.S. could be held liable except for certain exceptions. Exceptions are if someone's injured in active combat. There are lots of different exceptions. Military police. If you're a military person and you're injured on base by another military person, that's not covered. But if you're a third party, I happen to go to Fort Knox and I'm on the property and I slip and fall there and it's their fault, I can sue them, but I have to sue them under the Federal Torts Claims Act. And to do that, I have to use a specific administrative remedy first that I have to exhaust before I can file a lawsuit. And you only have 2 years from the date of the incident to file that. It's called a Form 95. Very few attorneys practice it. I'm one that does. And you have to know how to do it, and you have to do it right, because if you do it wrong, you're forever barred. What I'd like to talk about is suing medical providers that are arms of the federal government. For instance, the Veterans Administration Medical Center.
Sure.
They have clinics. They have the big VAs in Lexington and Louisville. I will tell you, I come from a long line of medical providers. Both my sisters-in-law and my mother-in-law are nurses. My husband's a doctor. And I know that for the vast majority, 99% of medical providers work their tails off to give outstanding care. The fact remains that folks make mistakes, and there's been a recent study that shows in a year's time there are over $400,000 medical mistakes made that cause injuries to folks. That being said, if you're at the VA and you believe you've been injured by a medical mistake by a doctor or any healthcare provider working in that system, you need to get to someone that understands the FTCA, the Federal Torts Claims Act, and knows how to sue the government. And really, when you do get finally to the point of being allowed to file a lawsuit, you don't sue Dr. Jones or Mary Smith, the nurse. You sue the United States of America, and you serve the U.S. Attorney General. It's a very complex, very specific form of litigation. So if you get hurt there, you have rights. If you're a veteran and you're not on active duty, as long as you're in active status, and you get hurt in the course and scope of your treatment at the VA or their clinics, you have a right to seek reimbursement, to seek pain and suffering. It is something that you're entitled to do.
One of the things that come to my mind about VA and care of our veterans is timing. Is that considered? In other words, if someone's on a waiting list and the doctors or the medical staff knows that they've got a medical issue that's not going to get, it's going to get worse by waiting, and we've heard of people that have been on, have to wait I'm going to throw out a number, a year for. Is that something that is?
It's very hard to get around the 2-year statute of limitations.
But no, I'm saying is that
it
negligence
negligence?
if they can't get treatment?
If they delay care,
yeah.
And they knew if the standard of care is that this, for instance, we have a case right now with a guy that's probably going to lose both of his feet because of failure for the federal medical center to provide him adequate treatment for his diabetes. And they've delayed and they've delayed and they've delayed. They sent him out to UK for a referral, and the guy said, "You've got to get this guy to a podiatrist right away or he's going to lose his foot." They never did. And he's going to lose both feet. It's just the fact of the matter. And their delay is what caused it.
Right.
And these delays in the system are, in fact, negligence when the doctor knew or should have known that this required prompt treatment. He failed to get the prompt treatment, and that resulted in the person's injuries. So yes, that the delay in the system can be grounds for negligence.
And as you pointed out, I mean, the system itself is overwhelmed, and that doesn't mean that you don't have recourse if
Right.
that overwhelming of the system has caused certainly horrific permanent
Right.
situations.
Right.
And I think it was Arizona that had all the delays. They had a list of people.
Kind of when it first started hitting
yeah.
the news I believe was Arizona.
Well, if you think about the sheer volume of veterans that we have the veterans from the Vietnam era. They're getting of age where they're going to have heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, and then you have the young men and women from Afghanistan and that era, or the Iraqi era, that have PTSD, that have all kinds of medical problems, and they get their primary medical treatment from the VA,
Right.
from Ireland Army Hospital,
Right.
from different places. We have a massive amount of veterans that are needing of and deserving medical treatment, and unfortunately a federal government that doesn't have enough money, facilities, physicians to get them all in. And like you said, you can call the VA and say, "I'm having this problem, I need to get in," and they say, "How's 3 months from Tuesday?"
Yeah.
And so I do believe, like I said, 99% of the providers out there are doing the very best that they can, but mistakes are made and there is recourse for it. But by golly, you better get an attorney that knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
Well, we, of course, now just in the last 48 hours read that these are for, I think, just for active duty, but the Warrior Transition Unit, 10 of the 26, including one at Fort Knox, are being shut down in the basically next year. Of course, many of as what you're talking about, Sheila and Chad, are the fact that they are veterans, but there are so many young men and women leaving the armed forces now as they continue to shrink that number, that they're moving right into an already overtaxed medical provision.
Yeah.
And I hate to hear that they're shutting those down because, and I'm working with a family I just started working with last week where their son committed suicide from PTSD.
Yeah.
And first of all, there's an unnecessary shame associated with seeking mental health treatment. And that is offered through the VA, and I think it should be insisted upon for everybody that leaves ETAs I, it, it's something that there's no shame in seeking mental health treatment. You should get it. If you see your loved one is suffering from it and they have served and they've witnessed what we all know are horrible things, get them the mental health care they need, because I can help this woman maneuver through the system and try to get justice for her son, but I can't bring her son back. And the only thing that can is if we take the shame away from PTSD and get the people that we love and the people that we know into the system to make sure they're getting the care that they need.
And make sure the system works.
Yes.
Right? Whatever the cost. You know, so many of them have given more than we could ever imagine. So again, it's tricky, and without the services of expert legal advice, it's near impossible for an individual to take care of themselves or a loved one that's suffered some damages from medical or lack of medical from government.
It's very difficult. Get to an attorney for certain.
Yeah.
Has anything come out of the Affordable Care Act that it's created some medical malpractice? I use medical malpractice, but created some situations? I mean,
I don't know that the data's out on that yet. I know that they have found, my husband does auditing for Kentucky's Medicaid system, and the Affordable Care Act has provided medical care to an immense amount of people and has actually lowered the medical cost. You wouldn't think it would have, but we're already getting data back that because people are seeking preventative care, it's lowering the extreme medical cost of emergent situations. Right. So it seems to be working parts. I'm sure that there are repairs that need to be made to it. There are changes that need to be made. I have not received any data that it's contributed to or created new medical negligence. I think that's going to just have to be a wait and see, and hopefully it won't. You know, from a political standpoint, I'm not in a position to speak one way or another to the merits of the overall proposal. I just know that my husband recently told me it has cut down on medical cost while providing medical care to more people.
But I think statistically, you know, more people are going to the doctor than ever before, so you're going to see a larger number of cases. Now, I don't know that the percentages would necessarily
now that
change.
they finally have insurance, they're going to go.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
But the good news is they're going to the doctor and getting it early, as we say.
That's
if you
right.
can get into the doctor and typically in the pay for the services you can when they get into the VA and that type of program. But hopefully we can get some people healthier faster before it gets into
That's exactly
catastrophic.
right.
Whistleblowers. I guess the number one whistleblower comes to my mind was the guy in the tobacco industry that actually made a movie about in 20, 30 years ago. I can't remember the name
I remember what you're talking about. In fact, wasn't it a paralegal in Louisville that snuck the documents out?
I believe that's, yeah. So kind of started some things.
This is a little different, and it kind of goes along the lines of what we were talking about with the VA. It's another special area of the law that relates to if you see someone committing fraud against the government. So, for example, if you work at a medical facility and your employer is running unnecessary tests, billing them to Medicare or Medicaid, or having people come in testing positive for the flu and then admitting them to the hospital. Again, not necessarily something you would have to be admitted to the hospital for, but a way for an employer to make money. And what's happened over the last 15 to 20 years, we've had a lot of for-profit companies take over hospitals that were primarily Medicaid, Medicare funded. So you've got an incentive there. You've got a for-profit entity that's got to make money somehow, and the one way they can make it is by increasing their revenue, which means increase their billing. And so there is similar to the Federal Tort Claims Act, there is what's the acronym? I've already forgotten it.
I haven't forgotten it too.
False Claim.
It's a False Claims Act.
The False Claims Act.
FCA.
It's a separate body of law where, again, like the Federal Tort Claims Act, there are certain procedures that you have to go through, and basically a whistleblower has to gather up all of their evidence, get all the work done, and then file a lawsuit that's sealed. So nobody knows it's been filed except the judge and the U.S. attorney. They then look at it and look at your evidence, and they decide whether or not the federal government's going to jump in and take over your lawsuit, or whether they're going to just let you do it on your own. And as a whistleblower, you would be entitled to a percentage of what you save the government,
Right.
you know, what you can show the fraud was. And so it's a real complicated area of law, but it's actually one that comes up a lot in Kentucky. We have a lot of hospitals, a lot of rural hospitals, where a lot of the population base is in fact going to be Medicare and Medicaid, especially with the Affordable Care Act. You know, you're starting to get a lot of folks
That's right.
now coming back in with that government funding. So it's an area that almost unfortunately we're seeing an uptick in potential cases in our business. And so just wanted to make people aware of it. If you're out there working in an industry where Medicare and Medicaid are being billed, keep an eye on it, because you certainly don't want to be caught up in the fraud. And there's this fine line between a good corporate policy, you know, they're there to make money, there's nothing illegal or wrong with that, and then overstepping those bounds and getting into the areas where you're...
You're talking just medical, but does it expand out to any fraud against federal government? Because I
Yes.
know that a gentleman is just getting ready to do some time from doing some things at Fort Knox.
Right.
It was involved in some construction, energy management type stuff.
Right.
And you're dead on. It's any time someone is submitting a claim to the government to be
The
paid
government, for anything.
for anything. If you're submitting false claims, the False Claims Act is there to encourage whistleblowers to come up and stop the fraud.
And something you should know when it does involve a hospital, and say you're working there as a nurse and you're seeing them repeatedly do things, and you say, that's not right. And you start to look at patients' records and they're admitting them for 3 weeks for something that they shouldn't be admitting them for, and you see them bilking the government. Everybody knows what HIPAA is. You can't go to the doctor now without having to read a 7-page thing and sign off on it that you understand the Privacy Acts. HIPAA has an exception for if you're a healthcare provider and you see this abuse of the system, to allow you to collect information and data to support your position that the government is taking advantage. And again, people's privacy information is still protected because it is under seal. It only goes to the court, and it only goes to the U.S. attorney. So it's not something where it's being disseminated to the public.
Right.
But don't be afraid. If you see this happening, you should go to an attorney first before you collect anybody's records or copy anything, and make sure you're doing
That's
it
what I'm saying.
properly.
Make sure,
Right.
yeah.
Absolutely. But there are you're not violating HIPAA laws if you see it happening, and if you're working with an attorney, and if you've received proper instructions on how to follow that.
Because this is, like I say, is an area you don't want to get yourself in trouble. You're trying to
That's right.
That's
to right a
exactly right.
potential wrong and help. If you help the government, you're supposed to be helping us all.
And they're
Exactly.
not supposed
Yeah.
to be allowed to fire you. It's considered a retaliatory firing.
Yeah.
They can make your life a living.
You know what?
Yeah,
but
but-
even that is could be retaliatory.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to speak up.
Yeah. I did not realize we had a whistleblower issue that was versus the government, but I guess I just have seen the ones I've seen seem to have been more associated
Private.
with private.
Yeah, yeah.
And where
But this-
they also have the ability to claim some.
They're usually private
Yeah.
contractors that the government gives them the bid, and then they bilk them. They charge them $75 for a 2x4, or
Right.
something like that. And there's some, whether it is a payroll clerk or it is someone that's going through the books, and they go, wait a minute, there's something amok here, and they see there is, under our government law, an obligation upon every single citizen of the United States to protect the coffers of the United States. So when you see that the American state, our country is being built, you have an obligation to protect the government. And that's what you see in this False Claims Act, that this is your duty. This is your civil duty, and we want to reward you for